Good morning, Seahawks. My name is Hunter Jones, and I work as the Bozeman Gallery's intern for Campus Life. My job is to ensure operations in and around the gallery run smoothly so that you, the general public, may enjoy all our wonderful exhibits showcasing the work of our students, alumni, and even those in our local community. Today's interview will be for our gallery highlighting the legacy of protest in Wilmington. This gallery is slightly different from our usual in that it is a collaboration with our very own Sarah Gaby and her students who have worked tirelessly this past semester to investigate and procure various examples of racial injustice, both past and present, in order to encourage efforts towards diversity and inclusion in our local community. So, good afternoon, Sarah, and thank you for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me.
All right, so I have some questions for you that will hopefully help shed some light on the subject matter, as well as help our listeners figure out more ways that they can get involved in their local communities. So, first off, tell us more about what it is you teach and why exactly it is important to you.
Sure. So this is a class that I've just brought to UNCW, which I've taught at other institutions I taught before on social movements. It's really focused on understanding the dynamics of mobilization, what leads movements to emerge, what brings people to be involved in social movements across the political spectrum, and when and how can those movements have a strong impact. And so the class itself is really focused on the kind of theory and the nitty gritty of mobilization and social movements. But the important component, which I try to bring to these classes, is how can we see these dynamics in our own community? And so that's really where this gallery piece comes in. This is really closely tied to my own work, which is studying social movements, thinking about sort of ways that social movements change over time and the way that they remain constrained by things like legacies of racial violence, which we'll talk about more with the gallery as well.
So, uh, that being said, what is the main message of this gallery in particular that you hope people will take away when they view the gallery and the work that your students have put together?
When we first sort of came up with this idea for the gallery, we knew that it would be somewhere closely tied to anti-racist sort of ideologies that are growing in the Wilmington community. But really, we were focused on trying to understand the long ties between a history of protest in the community, both sort of stemming from 1898 and the riot and massacre that happened then, and sort of moving us through the civil rights era, really thinking about Wilmington as this place of protest in some ways. And so we were really interested in getting the students to think through the kinds of social movements that are happening in their community. They led the gallery into a really wonderful place, I think, where it sort of brings together white supremacy movements over time, starting back in even a little before 1898, and then moving into contemporary movements around white supremacy, but also thinking a lot about the anti-racist efforts that are happening in Wilmington and trying to bring those parts of mobilization into conversation. So how can we see the sort of interactive dynamics between white supremacy movements in Wilmington, of which there's a long and deep history, and anti-racist movements around civil rights movement and these kinds of movements that have come through the community as well. So I think in the whole, the message is both one of my students said this best. They said that what we can see from the gallery is that we've come a long way, but we haven't come far enough. So we can see where we've come to challenge the longstanding history of white supremacy in Wilmington and the community, and where collective effort has made some change around that, but we can also see how far we have to go. And so I think one of my students really summed up the message as we hope the community will receive it.
Thank you. Well, while the history of protests in Wilmington is, I feel, more relevant now than ever, what are some ways people can continue kind of pushing this awareness, even after kind of the public eye has shifted towards other causes and other movements? Because I know sometimes they build up steam and they go for a while, but sometimes they just fall off fall off the radar, as it will.
We talk about in the class a lot about cycles of protest, right? So protest kind of comes and goes, comes and goes. And as the consumer, when we see it, we normally think, oh, we're in this period of Black Lives Matter mobilization. We see this happening in Wilmington, for instance. And we kind of think of this as a distinct moment in time. But I think the important thing for kind of a critical analysis of what's going on around mobilization is contextualizing that, right? So in Wilmington, for example, we see a long history of Black middle class being pushed out, right, of this transition from Black governance to white governance and big community shifts. A lot of sort of declining population in some of these areas. And so when we think about Black Lives Matter, it's not really about response to police violence, although that's an important part. It's about this long history of racial strife in the community. So how can we continue to really contextualize these things and sort of tie them into their places in history, both kind of, even if you just think about like the NAACP has a face in Black Lives Matter, right? But also you can think about the NAACP back to the early 1900s in Wilmington. And so how do we contextualize all this into the longer history of mobilization and the longer history of racism in the community as well, and how those dynamics are really influencing each other?
So, what are some other, I guess, causes that you feel go unnoticed that you think should receive more exposure than they do?
Yeah, when we sort of mapped out this class, uh, our wonderful teaching assistant Pablo and I looked around and we reached out to a bunch of historians in the community to say, what do you think the big social movements in Wilmington are that students might be able to sort of have enough material to really do something interesting on? And it turns out that there's a lot of really interesting sort of ties in Wilmington that people don't think about. So the Gen X issue, right, around the Cape Fear. Well, actually, the Cape Fear has a long history of protests on all sorts of different kinds of issues, a port issue back in the 1800s, a bunch of stuff that comes out sort of in connection to the fact that this river is so important to the community that we don't really think about. And so it's not, if we think about the kind of issue around chemers and clean water and access and how that's shaping Wilmington, we can also think historically about why that river is so important, why Wilmington comes up around the river, sort of related issues. So that's one of the interesting ones that our students talked about quite a bit in the early period before they really settled on the gallery sort of vision. The environment in general has been a kind of an ebb and flow source of attention, environmental justice issues in Wilmington, especially around placements in the community and things like that, but also, being a coastal city, experiencing climate change in a different way, trying to really think about what kind of mobilization for change there is, protection of species and things like that. These are sort of long-standing challenges for the community that, again, you'll see these ebbs and flows, but they have this long arc of kind of thinking about the place of Wilmington and why it's meaningful, and then how we see these movements come and go over time.
Yeah, very interesting. I remember the Gen X thing being something that was like, I remember in passing when I originally came to Wilmington from Fayetteville, everyone talked about it, but I was like, I knew nothing, little next to nothing about it.
Right. Yeah. And there was some mobilization. There was a lot of community work around trying to engage in it, and um, I think it really does point to the importance of the Cape Fear River for Wilmington and Fayetteville, but for Wilmington, right,
Yeah,
as a
of
place,
course.
and the way that we can kind of see the community, like even downtown touches the river, right? It's like these are the kinds of positions of the community that sort of placed right between the river and the ocean, right? That this shapes so much of the layout of our community. So.
Mhm. So some say that art and social movements kind of go hand in hand. And would you agree with this?
Yeah, so we in my class we use music to start every class because social movements are so much about expression, right? And a lot of it is about identity and the ways that we generate those kinds of expression and we emphasize our identities are through things like art and music. And so, you can think about graffiti, for instance, as a big part of different kinds of social movements, right? We always think of protest signs, which I think are a form of art, as one of the kind of markers of when we can point to say that's a social movement, this is what's going on. And so I think that art and this kind of expression becomes a really important part of social movements. For us, we really wanted to think about what could we do sort of in a way that brings history and art together. Like when my students were doing this research, for instance, they uncovered documents that have never been digitized and then figured out neat things they could do with them, like the constitutional bylaws of the 1898 government. Just really neat stuff that's hidden somewhere in history that has the capacity to generate sort of motivation and interest from an artistic perspective once we can kind of draw it out of those buried archives. Or how do we see the environment that we're in on campus or in our community, and then try to view it from a historical standpoint as well. So can we bring those images together to create something which is a piece of art, but also which reminds us of kind of where the history of the place we're sitting in comes from?
Yeah, in my experience, I've always felt that the main purpose of art is to elicit some sort of emotional response, and I feel like that is a wonderful way to get others to join a cause,
Yeah.
especially. So, how is it that protests and social movements make a meaningful impact on society? Because I know you'll come across people all the time that will maybe try to invalidate things like protests by saying they don't actually do anything or they don't actually get any change. And so I just wonder what your thoughts on sentiments like that would be.
Sure. I mean, I tend to think of this as sort of that's sort of a narrow view of social movements, right? Is like, does the Black Lives Matter movement eliminate police violence? No, right? Do we make a lot of incremental changes in both the culture and understanding of relationships between police and communities, of resources that are distributed to policing and how we distribute other resources in our community, all these things which we can make small and incremental changes about? Yeah, maybe, right? When people talk about successful social movements, they often talk about something like the civil rights movement, right? It has these really measurable policy outcomes. We see a big cultural shift, which we attribute to the civil rights movement around race relations in this country. That's great. By and large, a movement's not going to do that, right? Most of the movements that we can think of don't have an outcome like that. What they have is outcomes that matter in all kinds of other ways. They make small changes which lead to bigger changes, right? We can think about marriage equality and all the mobilization that happened working towards marriage equality, which ultimately becomes a Supreme Court decision, but there's years and years and decades of work to even get that on the agenda of the Supreme Court, right? So sometimes movements are just doing the agenda setting work of our communities. That's a big impact that makes a big change. Sometimes movements are just generating ideas which become more sort of acceptable in the greater environment, right? And so we can kind of watch over time how opinions of women in the workforce change, right? Of women as voters change. And we can see, the suffrage movement does a lot of work just to change the perception of whether or not women can vote. And so there's a lot, I think, that goes on in movements which make something that we might not say is broad sweeping change, but ultimately produces those broad sweeping changes or has a role to play in it. And then movements do a whole bunch of other things. They impact people who participate in them. Those people go on often to do other kinds of social change work, right? Whether it's institutionalized through their roles in politics or as academics or potentially in other sorts of social movements or social change work. They bring in elites like political elected officials and celebrities and folks who maybe wouldn't have had these issues on their agendas and then do, and maybe make some changes through their pathways as well. And so I think so much of it is really trying to deconstruct what movements are doing in all kinds of ways, in identity work, in cultural work, in policy and practice, but not always. And so movements really, I think, even though they often fail. In fact, if they're doing work well, they fail too, right? Because once they achieve the thing they set out to achieve, there's not really a need for the movement anymore. But then they leave behind all of this material, which can be used by other movements, which can be used by governance for change. And so there's just so much that they do that can make change, even if it's not sort of a touch your finger to it, say this is the change that they made. I think a lot about the Tea Party movement. People say the Tea Party movement is gone, but that's totally false, right? The Tea Party movement supported the election, helped to elect lots of elected officials who are still in office, right? Those people are still making decisions with the ideologies that came from the mobilization around their election. And so I think we can see a lot of power behind movements even when they're gone, right? And it doesn't disappear just if the movement disappears, the kind of work that they've done and the kind of progress that they made.
Right. Even on an individual level, such as myself, who might not have exposure to any of these issues, I hear about them, and I want to do some research. I want to do some homework. I want to look into it. So even on small scale, changes like that can be very important in my eyes, at the very least.
Yeah, absolutely. The public nature of the kinds of social movements that are in the gallery, for instance, bring people in, right? And they require a conversation and they require engagement with the issues. And I think that's one the sort of attention to those kinds of issues is one of the big roles of movements as well.
Yeah. Speaking of our gallery, I guess that leads into my next question of, are there more ways that you feel the university can contribute to these movements or at least recognize issues that they might highlight?
Yeah, as somebody who studied legacies of racial violence before I came to Wilmington, of course, I was aware of the events around 1898. And I was honestly shocked by how many of my students had never heard of it. The university is doing some initiatives on that now, but I think it sort of shows the broader ways in which we um, kind of suppress history, whether intentionally or not, and then keep it out of our sort of knowledge base. And so, for example, the university just put out a big grant for developing new classes around 1898 for folks to teach. The university's been around a long time, and that means lots and lots of students came through UNCW probably have no idea about the history of the place that they were living. So I think that's one important thing. I think by and large the university is it is a result of the community that it came up in, is closely tied to the same kinds of histories we're talking about in this gallery, right? One of my students studied Keenan and the Keenan family, right? We know that there's buildings on campus bearing the same name. These legacies of racial violence are on our campus too. And so I think at very bare minimum, being critically reflective about those things, but also thinking about whether there's change to be made there. The kind of end of the gallery presentation that students really wanted to focus on is thinking about things like reparations, commemoration. How do we recognize what's happened in our history and try to think about making peace with it, right? Is there a chance for reconciliation in our community? And I think the university has to ask itself the same question. What is its role in reconciliation in the community? Because the university and the community are very closely tied. And so, critically reflecting on our role in both the history of Wilmington, especially, in the past several decades, and then the future of Wilmington. What do we want it to look like, and how do we want to kind of make peace with that as best we can? And so, I think those are the kinds of questions that are hard, that require some change, that we need to engage in. And then how does that shape our student body, our classes that we're offered, our structure, who's in our administration, right? And so really critically evaluating ourselves in that way.
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, this next question is kind of more for me, just this kind of fun set aside. But do you have like a favorite spot in Wilmington? Is there like a restaurant or a place you just go to kind of relax and unwind or have fun?
So the beach. So I'm originally from Miami, Florida. So I love the beach. And then I lived in Massachusetts, which is not very beachy, and then St. Louis, which is nowhere near a beach. So I'm really happy to be back to the beach for sure. And I love the South End because you have the calm on one side and the waves on the other. So it's great for everyone. It's good for kids to play in. And there's a lot of sand and beach and plenty of places to go. A little trail through the woods there. And so I think it's really peaceful and beautiful. It's when I came to interview, I went there and just spent a few minutes on the beach, and it's like you can't replace that. It's something so amazing about Wilmington and about living in the community. So
Yeah, I haven't been out to the beach much myself since it started warming up, which I'm still kicking myself for, but I'll get out eventually. You mark my words.
classes are almost over. So
Yes. So, last question. Is there anything else that I might not have hit in this interview that you would like to share with our viewers? This is kind of your opportunity to kind of say your piece, whatever you have.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of times with the students talking about the experience of building this gallery and sort of what we've put forward and how they think that interacts with the community. And I think there's been a lot of really interesting challenges doing this during a global pandemic, in terms of even just access to historical materials and things like that. But also, I think students really came to find and value the opportunities that the digital communities created for us. So we can reach out to folks and organizations to bring their voices into this gallery that we otherwise would have a really hard time connecting to, because we have access and because it's normal to do things like this and interview someone on Zoom now. So I think that's one interesting thing that's really come out from doing this. But I think the thing that's really resonated with my students the most is, the class is all white, and we're really trying to engage in a community whose conversation about legacies of racial violence is certainly one that needs to include a more diverse set of participants than that. And so my students have asked, in various ways, how we can think critically about engaging the community. And we've done some of the work to do that by bringing in the voices of community members to sort of help us understand both the initiatives in Wilmington, of which there are many, which I'll say in a minute, but also, of critically reflecting on the kinds of things that we're bringing up in the gallery. And so, Some of that I think goes back to your question about the university, right? And its sort of diversity in student population and challenges around that. But I think a lot of it goes back to the kinds of things that we need to think about more generally in our community. Whose voice is elevated? Who gets to speak? Where do we kind of think about diversifying the voices in our conversations, and the importance of that? The community is a lot of wonderful initiatives. I think my students knew about a few, but very, very many they didn't. Right? There's a community remembrance project to think about the folks who were killed in 1898 as part of collective racial violence. There's initiatives of restorative justice to think about the long history of the justice system and its race relations in the community and how that shaped unequal policing, unequal other issues, not just in the contemporary period, but sort of in this long history. And there's a lot of wonderful work in the community to think about, voting disenfranchisement, all these issues which are closely tied to, I think, the topics that are coming up. And so I'd encourage folks to get involved in the community in these kind of initiatives. Seeing the gallery and understanding, taking these classes on 1898 and understanding these things is great and it's really important. But the action of what you do with that, I think, is even more important. And so we have some of the opportunities up in the gallery wall so folks can kind of see what they are and think about places that they might be able to get involved. But certainly, I think finding a pathway to become involved in the community and to critically engage with these kinds of issues and whatever feels of interest to the viewer, I think is really important.
Yeah, very, very much so. We've been doing some own initiatives of our own within the professional realm on the student employee side of things, and our supervisors have been very good at teaching these lessons and kind of getting us to engage a bit more in practices that would better the community as a whole, I feel, at the very least.
Yeah, and that stuff is so important and it needs to happen in all kinds of places to make change, right? The whole story of the gallery is it's collectives that make change, not individuals. And so we need these collective efforts for change and to face our past and think about our future in Wilmington.
No, I thank you once again, Sarah, for letting us showcase this very important piece of history while also continuing to educate and inform our future students about the importance of activism in our community. I really do wish you the best going forward.
Thanks so much, and thanks for all your help.
Of course. So this gallery will be open for in-person visits, which I highly encourage from April the 19th all the way through early September. If you like this interview and like to see more, then be sure to follow our Instagram at UNCW Campus Life or subscribe to our YouTube where future exhibits and interviews will be posted there. And thank you for watching.